Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. Today we're going to be going over critical damage, but also critical rate and critical avoidance rate. I was actually inspired to do this based upon CTIA's 140 and MA2 released earlier this week, and then coincidentally Shadowlix just came out and is exactly right up the alley for what this topic needs to cover anyways. So let's get into things. Why is crit rate and crit damage typically overlooked or at least relatively unknown for many in the game? Well, so number one, there's obviously more important stats to focus on first. Agility, your just general attack and magic, the resists you have, the more consistent modifiers that apply all the time, not just upon critical hit. So there's no real priority in terms of how you gear people that this obviously falls a little bit more toward the bottom. Now, it's also somewhat obscured behind logarithmic math equations where it's not easy to ballpark or calculate exactly what the rates are. There's a general idea, but obviously it makes it more difficult for people to intuitively see in the game. And then finally, the kind of last, particularly for the damage calculation on the formula. So even regardless of just general equipment, in terms of doing the calculations roughly in your head, you first really need to prioritize penetrations and other modifiers, your attack and magic, the resist. And honestly, by that time, most people are mathed out, myself included. It gets too hypothetical at that point to really try to calculate every single crit rate and crit avoidance and crit damage at all times, particularly when you throw unit affinity in there as well, where your dexterity and luck stats are constantly changing. But that doesn't mean we should know about it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't still build for it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't know when it's still opportune. That's what this presentation is for. So first, how to calculate crit rate. I'm going to go through this very high level. Your critical hit rate relies only on your dexterity stat. So theoretically, you would put your dexterity stat into this formula, and then technically you would add any percentage of crit rate up. So if you have a weapon that has 18 crit rate on it, that means you take your dexterity, put that as part of the formula, and then you add the 18% after. Now for the critical avoidance rate, you take your luck stat instead. So the critical hit rate is your attacker, the crit avoidance rate is your defender, whoever is getting attacked. You take the luck stat, put this into here, and then same concept, you take their critical avoidance percentages and you add the two together. And then finally is where you combine the two of them together. So you take your crit hit rate from this first part, subtract the crit avoidance rate equals what the actual crit rate is. Now, if you were to graph these two formulas, just how the game balances them innately from a mathematical perspective, crit rate is always going to be higher than crit avoidance, so that there's always, at least mathematically, a chance that it happens. Now, obviously, characters have different dexterity and luck values that it doesn't always happen, but this is just from the equation perspective. And although this is the full chart looking at values of dexterity and luck, no one's got less than 300 of either. In terms of just total stats, you're always above 300 basically. So if we kind of focus in on that part of the chart, looking at these two lines, the innate difference mathematically between the two is roughly about 20%. So it's balanced so that crit rate should always be 20% higher than crit avoid. Again, just mathematically, not character specific. And it is sort of linear past a certain point, unlike the whole evade and accuracy equation, where at least the accuracy equation doesn't have any kind of consistency, but it's not exactly linear. There's not a number that you can just, divide by and get a rough approximation of, even though it does look like these are straight lines. But let's skip ahead here and look at a real life example to kind of contextualize this. So let's assume CTIA is attacking Snow. And again, I made this presentation for CTIA, not for Shadowlix. And then we're going to calculate CTIA's starting crit hit rate. We're then going to calculate Snow's crit avoidance rate. I just pulled a build that we used recently for CTIA. She's got 480 dexterity, 55% extra critical hit rate percentage points. And then Snow, I pulled again a build we had recently, 386 luck with 48% crit avoidance from his equipment. If we were to do the calculations on this, well, first you take CTIA's dexterity stat, you plug it into that equation that we had there, and this is basically the same equation, just reformatted for Excel calculations, and the times 100 is in here to convert it to a true percentage. So her dexterity stat gives her 117% crit rate. You add the 55% here, so her total starting crit rate is 172%. We repeat that process for Snow. So you take that 386 luck, throw it into that equation that we'd highlighted. He has an innate 81% critical avoidance rate here. We add the extra 48 percentage points, so his total critical evasion is 129%. The final step now, we take CTIA's total crit hit percent and subtract Snow's crit avoidance percent. So 172 minus the 129 means CTIA, when attacking Snow, has a 43% chance that it is a successful critical hit. That's that whole calculation in a nutshell. Now, I did create some tables here for some rough guesstimating if you were to look in-game values. Again, it's not exactly to scale, and these percentages aren't exact. I literally am doing this to kind of ballpark that if you wanted to memorize these values, I think that'd go a long way, where if you saw someone that was roughly around 500 dexterity, you know that their crit rate's around 120%. This obviously doesn't include the actual crit percent that you can add on to things, but at least from a dexterity and luck perspective, I wanted to give some relativity here that if you saw these values in game, you could kind of approximate what the crit hit and crit avoidance is. And again, it's not exactly linear. I've rounded a couple things here. But now let's look at how crit damage works. And this does require a little bit of knowledge around how the damage formula works. In total, I won't go over the full calculation top to bottom right now. I do have a video on that, and I'll link that in the description here. But I'll walk through the steps just very high level. Crit damage acts as a modifier in your equation. So example, that's exactly the same as slash stack up, man eater up, I stack up, all those things. It's just a modifier in the equation. Now, when you critically hit someone, you get 25 modifier, always, no matter what. Now, crit damage up continues to add to that modifier. So if you took crit damage 10 from a Trust Stone passive, when you critically hit someone, you get 35 added to the modifier instead of 25. Now, the difficult thing is that extra crit damage should really be one of the last things you focus on modifier-wise. There's a couple that you want to focus first always, because crit damage only applies if you critically hit. The other modifiers will apply almost always. So for instance, element attack, the weapon type attack, man-eater if you're in PvP. Those modifiers will apply all the time to all attacks no matter what. So once you've got those ones squared away, then you can focus on the crit damage modifier. So you may not always have the opportunity to put this into your builds, but there's opportunities where you can and should be. Again, for instance, if Cetia, if you have the option and you have to pick between the two, you have the option to pick either fire damage 10 or crit damage 10, always take the fire damage 10 because it applies to every single attack every single time. Crit damage only applies if it's critical hit, which in the prior example we only saw was a 43% chance in that instance. Now, when is the crit modifier best overall in some general situations? So it's generally thought to be on best on abilities that have lower modifiers. This is kind of the math theory as to why. If you take a 121% ability, again a lower modifier ability, add that 25 crit bonus to it, you go from 121 to 146. That's a 21% increase in what I call the incoming damage. That's the damage that you're sending at your enemy that's about to be discounted for resistances and stuff before you get to final damage. That's a 21% in damage. If you take a 200% modifier ability and add the 25 crit bonus, you go from 200 to 225. That's only a 12.5% increase. Now, obviously, 225 is way bigger than 146. So still, you're going to do more damage no matter what. So that's not to say that crit bonus is better in one situation than another, but it has more impact on a lower modifier ability. It's one of the reasons why typically it's so good for missile units who, at least historically, had skewed lower on the modifier side of things. Less so now with some of these cost 100 missile units where their modifiers are basically equal to many of the other attack types, but they also run high in crit rate and dexterity as well, which is all part of this damage output. And then the other thing here is when there's ability effects tied to your crit rate, which means you should be building for it anyways. And what I mean by that is, let's say someone like Cloud, he's got a buff for teammates that if you critically hit, you restore AP. Well, if you have an ability that requires crit hits to proc an effect, you should be building for crit rate, regardless of the crit damage. The same can be said for someone like Lightning from Final Fantasy 13, who can proc slow on an enemy if it's a critical hit. In that case, again, regardless of even just the damage, you should be gearing for the crit rate so you can get the full effect of that ability. So realistically, crit modifiers are good all the time. There's really not a good time. You just never want to give up a consistent modifier for a crit damage modifier if you can help it. But what about crit avoidance? Obviously, that's a big X factor in here too. Crit rate has to take into account crit avoidance. That'd be like talking about accuracy without taking into account evasion. You have to have both in the conversation. So crit avoidance, very underrated as a concept. Now, it's not perfect and it is complex, and I could talk about this for an hour, but I'm going to try to keep this concise and high level for everybody here, right? And I'm going to talk about it through the lens of the Trust Stone set bonuses. So the HP set bonus that most people build for, and for good reason, definitely keep building your HP sets, is that you get 5% extra element resistance. Now, you also get an extra 5% HP, but honestly, it's only about 200 HP, usually less even. It's really not that much. And then the HP stat per stone, 100 per stone, can often get cut in half because typically if you have an armor or a cloth, your Trust Stone will be the second highest HP, so it gets cut in half. So it's really the 5% extra element resistance that's the important thing here. And here's the thing that, again, is very hard to contextualize. If you have a character who has very high crit avoidance and is going to avoid most critical hits most of the time, then HP will always be the better option. But if you have a character that has low crit avoidance and using the crit avoid Trust Stone set makes it so that they take crit hits far less often, then that's a situation where crit avoid is very likely better than an HP set. And I'm going to talk through the math and the numbers why here. So as we saw in a previous slide, crit damage on a 121% modifier ability is a 21% increase in damage being sent to you. Well, again, if crit avoidance stones are the difference between you getting critically hit and not, if you have the HP set on, but it means you get crit hit all the time, then cool, you resist 5% extra damage, but you're going to take on 21% extra damage. That 5% mitigated means basically nothing if you're getting crit hit all the time, because you're going to take more damage because of those crit hits. And here's just a general math example we're going to kind of compare the two. Now, the first one we're going to look at is a higher modifier ability. So a couple assumptions here, and again, you could twist this 30 different ways, and I'm not even giving you any conclusive statements. This is literally just to like walk through the thinking process of it. Let's assume a slash attacker with 1600 attack, including the dexterity and agility. Some abilities have percentages of those stats in it. We're going to assume 1600 is just the number. Let's assume they have 50% defense pen and 50% slash attack resistance penetration. Pretty standard for many of them. Now, the attacker has a 200% modifier ability. Let's assume they also have 15 slash attack, 100 element attack, 25 human killer, and they're also going to have potential of 35 crit damage. So 25, which applies always if it's a crit hit, and an extra 10 from a Truststone passive. So altogether, 375% total modifier. Now let's assume the defender has 40 defense. Now again, that's effectively only 20 because of the penetration. Let's assume they have 26 slash resistance. It's really only 13. And let's assume they have 7% of an element resistance due to a Truststone passive. Now, I'm not going to assume any element strengths or weaknesses here. We're going to omit that from the calculation. But element resistance is one you should have all the time if possible. So the damage calculations on the HP set bonus, you take that 1600, multiply it by your modifier of 375, so it's 3.75 in this instance. The incoming damage, and again, that's what I call it, is 4,720. That's the damage that they're taking after their calculations. They're sending it at the defender. That's now going to be adjusted for all their resistances. So that 4,720, you're going to reduce it by 20%. That's the defense. You're then going to reduce it again by 13%. That's the slash resistance. You're then going to reduce it again by another 13%. That's your 7... And I'm an idiot. This is a typo. It should be 12%. This is your 7% element resistance plus the 5% set bonus. I can't believe I screwed that math up, but I'm not going back to edit now. Don't worry. It doesn't change with the takeaway here. You apply those resistances, that 4720 gets reduced to 3633, but then there's a bravery part of this equation where you basically multiply it by 1.5, and the final damage is 5340. Now again, we're assuming this person with the HP set bonus is getting critically hit. Let's assume the difference between getting critically hit and not is the crit avoidance set. You take that 1600, the modifier though drops from 375 to 3.4 because we're taking out the 35 crit damage. So it's only 4160 incoming damage. You apply all those same resists, except this time it's only 7% element resistance because you don't get the HP set bonus here. So sure, you resist less, but you are taking much less incoming damage because you're removing the crit damage modifier. 3521 multiplied by the bravery. Final damage 5176 is less than the HP set bonus. You take 3% less damage, and technically because of my mistake, this 5340 should be even higher because it should be 12% resistance, not 13. So again, if the difference between getting critically hit and not is your crit avoidance, you will technically take less damage like this. Now, example number 2, let's look at the lower modifier ability. All the same assumptions, literally everything exactly the same, but we're changing the modifier here to be 121%. So the new total modifier is 296. Same assumptions. The HP set bonus, your 1600 times 2.96, that's your new modifier. Go through all the same equation. You get to 4215 as your final damage. We're going to compare that to the crit avoidance set, 1600. We're going to drop off 35 crit damage modifier here. Now, so that goes from 296 to 2.6. Same process here. The final damage is 3958. That's 6% less damage. So again, that's where you're kind of seeing the difference in the modifier size affecting what the total damage output is. And again, that 6% is probably even a little higher because I screwed up on the 13% resistance here. Now, one step further, let's assume someone's going crazy amounts of crit damage, as high as you can possibly get, let's say, or close to it. So same assumptions, except this time we're going to add in some extra crit damage modifier. So 25 is just what you get no matter what. 10 from a Truststone passive. We're going to go assuming that they go crit rate set bonus on the right side. Now again, doesn't happen often and really not recommended, but that's another 10 from the set bonus, and then 25 from the vision card, let's assume, right? So your new crit damage modifier goes from 35 up to 70. So your new total modifier, 331. This is going to be the same exact scenario here, but now it's going to be much higher crit damage modifier. Run through the same equation. 4714 is the final damage with the HP set bonus. Assuming you don't get critically hit, that modifier changes from 331 down to 2.6. That's a big change if you can avoid taking that extra crit damage and run that through the equation, you end up with basically 700 HP less damage taken. That's a 16% damage reduction. Now, the final example I'm going to show here is if you didn't care about crit rate at all. Like, let's say you just were building for modifiers and didn't even think about it and put it anywhere in your equation, didn't try to build for crit rate or anything. So this time we're going to look at the HP set bonus without getting critically hit, or the HP set bonus with getting critically hit. So again, I'm really kind of speeding through this at this point. If you did not care about crit damage at all, you'd be missing out on that 70 modifier. You'd be doing 1,000 less damage on that same person with the HP set bonus if you didn't care about your crit rate and crit damage. So obviously that's a big factor in increasing your potential damage output. Now, some sources of how to build this: crit damage vision cards. Fleeting Blossom Banquet is one where it's acquired AP 15% to the party of any element, but Dark Element is crit damage 25. Near Automata is crit damage 25 to wind. Europa is 25 crit damage to lightning, and Dashing Over Snowy Field is 25 crit damage to water. So there are a couple elements which do skew more naturally toward crit damage outputs, and these are those elements. Water less so, but really Dark, Wind, and Lightning are the biggest ones. And then if we're looking specifically at characters here, now there's a lot of numbers here. I'm going to walk you through each one of these in a second. This list is sorted by this third column here. What is their crit rate with passive abilities equipped? But starting left to right, total innate crit percentage here on the left is taking into account their dexterity, their mastery abilities, and their board nodes. I've then implemented a hypothetical that if that character were to equip their crit rate passive, what would it be with passives? And the list ends up being Rob, Eliza, new Shadow Links unit, Ziza, Lucia, Violet, Flagbearer, Glaciella. So if you're looking at the top 10 here, really not a lot of meta units like Flag, Glaciella, and maybe Violet, right? Eliza too, obviously. But there's some characters that are heads and tails higher than the majority of many others that have a much higher chance of being able to take advantage of this crit damage. And related to Shadow Links, this is a big part of her potential damage output, that if you satisfy the Dark modifiers, the Man-Eater modifiers, the Pierce modifiers, then you can layer in the crit damage as well. She's very much going to be taking advantage of that extra damage output. So that's the presentation in a nutshell. Again, this is extremely complex. I've done my best to really compress it, talk about a couple hypothetical situations. There's many you can do, and obviously changes drastically depending upon the characters you're talking about, the builds you have, what content you're trying to do. So there is no right answer. But at least all I can do is hopefully enlighten some of you on a topic that you may not know about, help you think about it in a little bit of a different way, and obviously open the conversation for more people to learn about it so people can better utilize the strengths that certain characters are supposed to have. So that's it for now. In the meantime, thanks for watching, everybody. I'll talk to y'all soon.